A young boy dies, glimpses the afterlife, and returns, but not with comfort or hope. He brings a terrifying message that shakes the very core of what we believe about heaven. Shadows in paradise, warnings of something dark, and revelations no child should ever carry. What did he see beyond the gates, and why has his story left millions haunted? Small towns shaken by a medical nightmare. Imperial, Nebraska is the kind of town where life feels simple, almost timeless. Everybody knows everybody, and news travels faster than the wind. For the Burpo family, Todd, a pastor who worked multiple jobs, Sonia, a school teacher balancing her career with parenting, and their energetic 4-year-old son, Colton. Life was busy but filled with faith and love. They were an ordinary family in an ordinary town, but everything changed in the spring of 2003. It started innocently enough. Colton came down with what seemed like a routine stomach bug. Feverish and complaining of pain, he was initially treated at home with plenty of fluids and rest. Todd and Sonia, like most parents, assumed it was nothing serious. But within days, Colton's condition worsened. His pain grew unbearable, and he began clutching his stomach, crying in a way that shook Sonia to her core. This wasn't a normal illness. Something was terribly wrong. Their family doctor, trusted for years, misdiagnosed the problem. He told them it was just a severe case of the flu. "Keep him hydrated and he'll be fine," he said. But Sonia knew her son's cries weren't ordinary. The look in his eyes, the way he couldn't bear to move without screaming. It was clear this was far more serious. By the time Todd arrived home from one of his many jobs, Sonia was frantic. "We have to go back," she said, her voice trembling. This time the urgency was undeniable. The Burpos rushed Colton to the Great Plains Regional Medical Center, their hearts pounding with every passing mile. Sonia tried to soothe Colton in the back seat, while Todd gripped the steering wheel, praying silently. By the time they reached the hospital, their worst fears were confirmed. Colton's appendix had ruptured, causing a life-threatening infection to spread through his tiny body. The doctor's earlier dismissal had cost them precious time. The medical team acted quickly. Colton needed emergency surgery. The doctors were blunt. His chances of survival were slim. Sonia broke down in tears, the weight of the moment crashing over her. Todd, struggling to keep it together, kissed Colton's forehead as they prepared to wheel him into the operating room. "I love you, buddy," he whispered. Colton, barely conscious, managed a faint smile. "I love you too, Daddy," he replied. In the operating room, the situation was even graver than the doctors had anticipated. The infection had spread rapidly, and Colton's heart rate dropped to dangerously low levels. The medical team fought desperately to save him. Outside, Todd paced the waiting room, unable to sit still. He tried to pray, but found himself lost in a whirlwind of fear and desperation. Sonia clutched her phone, sobbing as she updated family members, her words trembling with panic. Every passing second felt like an eternity. And then something extraordinary happened. When Colton eventually woke up after the surgery, his parents were just relieved he had survived. But as he began to recover, Colton started to recount an experience that left everyone stunned. He claimed he had left his body during the surgery. He described watching the doctors work frantically to save him, mentioning tools and procedures he couldn't have possibly seen or understood. But it didn't stop there. Colton said he could see Todd and Sonia in the waiting room. He described his mother crying on the phone and his father pacing with his head bowed in prayer. Todd and Sonia were floored. How could their 4-year-old son know these things? He had been unconscious, his body fighting for survival. Yet the details he provided were strikingly accurate. Colton then said he had been pulled upwards into a place of light, warmth, and overwhelming love. He described figures that looked like angels, radiant and peaceful. And then, with the simple honesty of a child, he said he had met Jesus. He described Jesus in vivid detail, his brown hair, his kind eyes, and the scars on his hands and feet. The story only became more shocking when Colton mentioned meeting a sister he never knew he had. Sonia froze. Years before Colton was born, she had suffered a miscarriage, a painful memory she and Todd rarely discussed, even with each other. They had certainly never told Colton about it, yet here he was, describing a little girl who hugged him and said she couldn't wait to meet her family in heaven. "She looked like you, Mommy," Colton said, "but with dark hair." Sonia's tears flowed freely. How could Colton know this? The emotional weight of his words hit Todd and Sonia like a tidal wave. Was this truly a glimpse of the afterlife? Could their son have been chosen to deliver a message? A child's fight against impossible odds. When the Burpo family first rushed Colton to the Great Plains Regional Medical Center, they could never have imagined the nightmare that awaited them. What began as a seemingly minor stomach virus had escalated into a full-blown medical emergency. For Todd and Sonia, the hospital's fluorescent lights and sterile walls were a stark contrast to their close-knit, faith-filled life in Imperial, Nebraska. Here, they weren't just parents. They were witnesses to their child's harrowing fight for survival. By the time Colton was admitted, his condition had deteriorated so much that the doctors wasted no time in explaining the gravity of the situation. His appendix had ruptured, and the resulting infection had spread toxins throughout his small body. It was a scenario the medical team saw as dire. Even with immediate surgery, the odds were stacked against Colton. His tiny frame was no match for the aggressive infection that had taken hold. Time was running out. The moments leading up to the surgery were a blur for the Burpos. Todd, usually the steadfast rock of the family, felt his faith shaken to its core. He clung to the hospital's thin chapel walls, trying to pray but finding his words swallowed by fear. Sonia, on the other hand, barely left Colton's side. She held his hand tightly, whispering reassurances as if her voice could tether him to life. And then came the surgery itself. The operating room was a battlefield where the odds felt impossibly slim. The surgeons worked with meticulous precision, knowing that any misstep could tip the scales against Colton. At one point, his heart rate plummeted to a level that sent shockwaves through the room. The medical team scrambled, their urgency mirrored by the monitor's relentless beeping. This was not just another case. It was a desperate race to save a boy who, by all accounts, should not have survived as long as he had. Outside, Todd and Sonia waited. Todd's pacing grew frantic as the minutes dragged into hours. Sonia, gripping a hospital chair for dear life, clung to her phone, making call after call to update family and friends. "Pray for Colton," she told them, her voice cracking. "He needs every prayer we can muster." What they didn't know was that something extraordinary was unfolding in that very operating room. Colton, who appeared to be unconscious, later described it as the moment he left his body. While his parents were caught in the agony of the unknown, Colton said he found himself floating above the operating table, watching as the surgeons worked to save his life. He spoke with uncanny precision about the tools they used, the expressions on their faces, and even the words exchanged between the medical staff. But it wasn't just the surgical scene that Colton described. He claimed he could see beyond the walls of the operating room to the waiting area where Todd and Sonia were stationed. Colton described Sonia on the phone, her voice trembling as she updated relatives. He even knew exactly where Todd was pacing, head bowed in what could only be a silent, desperate prayer. How could a 4-year-old know these details, especially when he was sedated and on the brink of death? The surgery lasted much longer than the doctors had initially anticipated. Every additional minute in the operating room felt like another layer of dread for Todd and Sonia. When the surgeon finally emerged, his face bore the kind of weariness that spoke volumes. "He's alive," he said, though his tone carried a caveat. Colton had survived the surgery, but his condition was still precarious. The road to recovery would be long and uncertain, fraught with risks of infection and further complications. For the Burpos, relief came in waves, tempered by lingering fear. They were grateful for the miracle of Colton's survival, but terrified of what lay ahead. They spent the next several days camped out at the hospital, rarely leaving Colton's bedside. Sonia was the constant presence, watching over her son like a sentinel, while Todd alternated between quiet moments of prayer and hushed conversations with the doctors. It was during this fragile recovery period that Colton began to share his remarkable story. At first, his revelations came in fragments, seemingly unconnected remarks that Sonia chalked up to the delirium of a child recovering from major surgery. But the more Colton spoke, the more his parents realized that his words carried a weight that defied explanation. He told them he had been in heaven, not in the abstract, symbolic way that Sunday school teaches, but in a real, tangible sense. He described the overwhelming light, the warmth, and the peace he felt. "It was so bright, but it didn't hurt my eyes," Colton said. "It felt safe, like I was being hugged by the light." His voice carried the sincerity of a child who had just discovered something he couldn't quite explain but knew was true. Colton's descriptions were vivid and detailed. He spoke of angels, not as ethereal figures in white robes, but as beings of radiant light who sang in harmonies that filled him with joy. He talked about colors that didn't exist on Earth, skies that seemed alive, in a place where everything exuded love and peace. But it was his encounter with Jesus that truly stunned his parents. Colton described Jesus as kind, strong, and full of love. He had brown hair and a beard, Colton said, and his eyes were like the ocean, so full of love. He spoke about the scars on Jesus' hands and feet, a detail that left Todd and Sonia speechless. Colton's words didn't stop there. He talked about meeting his great-grandfather, a man he had never known in life. He described Pop as a young man, full of energy and detailed features that matched perfectly with old family photos Colton had never seen. But the most heart-wrenching revelation was when Colton said he had met his sister. "She hugged me," Colton told Sonia, "and said she couldn't wait for you to come to heaven." Sonia froze. Years earlier, she had suffered a miscarriage, a loss so painful that she and Todd had rarely spoken about it. They had never mentioned it to Colton. Yet here he was, describing a sister who couldn't possibly exist in his memory. He talked about her hair, her smile, and the way she radiated happiness. It was something that shattered Sonia's composure. She broke down in tears, overwhelmed by the simultaneous grief and comfort of knowing her lost child was, in some way, still present. Todd, too, felt the weight of Colton's words. As a pastor, he had spent years preaching about heaven and faith, but hearing his son's first-hand account made those teachings feel more real and more challenging than ever. It wasn't just a matter of belief anymore. It was a matter of reconciling his faith with the extraordinary story unfolding in front of him. The questions came quickly, and they were unrelenting. Could Colton's experiences be real? Was it possible for a child to have such a profound and detailed vision of heaven? Or was this the result of a vivid imagination, a side effect of anesthesia, or even the brain's way of coping with trauma? Heavenly secrets revealed by a 4-year-old. As Colton Burpo recovered more, his parents learned more. He started talking about the people he saw in heaven. "There were so many," Colton said, his small voice filled with certainty. "They were happy and they knew me. Even though I didn't know them, I felt like I belonged with them." Todd and Sonia were stunned. How could their little boy describe something so big? And then Colton dropped a detail that left them completely speechless. "I met Jesus," he said simply, like he was talking about meeting a neighbor. He had brown hair, a beard, and his eyes. They were so kind. "He really loves kids, you know." Todd felt his stomach twist. Jesus, his son was only 4 years old. While he had learned about Jesus at church, this description felt different, too personal, too detailed. "What did Jesus say to you?" Todd asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "He told me I had to come back," Colton said, shrugging like it was no big deal. "He said it wasn't my time yet." Colton's parents couldn't wrap their heads around it. The specifics he shared were things he couldn't have learned in Sunday school or from books, and the more Colton talked, the stranger it got. "There were angels everywhere," he said one afternoon. "They sang to me. The music, it was like nothing you've ever heard. It made me feel so happy." It wasn't just the angels or the light that Colton described. It was the way he talked about a sister he had never met. "I met her," he said one day, completely out of the blue. "She told me she's my sister." Sonia's heart stopped. Her mind raced back to a time before Colton was born, a time of pain and loss. She had suffered a miscarriage, something they had never told Colton about. Yet here he was, describing a sister they never mentioned. "She hugged me," Colton said. "She told me she couldn't wait for you to come to heaven." Sonia couldn't hold back the tears. "What did she look like?" she asked, her voice trembling. "She looked a little like you, Mommy," Colton said, "but with dark hair. She was really happy." It wasn't possible. Colton didn't even know about the miscarriage, but his words left no room for doubt. The girl he described was someone they had lost but never forgotten. How could he know? How could he possibly know? And just when Todd and Sonia thought they'd heard it all, Colton mentioned someone else. "I saw Pop," he said with a smile. Pop was Todd's grandfather, a man Colton had never met. He started describing him. Not as the older man Todd remembered, but as a young, vibrant version of himself. "He told me to tell you he's okay," Colton said. "He said he misses you, but he's happy." Todd pulled out an old photo album, flipping through pages until he found a picture of Pop as a young man. When he showed it to Colton, the boy lit up. "That's him," he said, pointing. "That's Pop." Todd's hands trembled. Colton had never seen that photo before. How could he have recognized it? The more Colton shared, the more questions his parents had. Could it really be true? Did their son actually visit heaven? Or was his mind creating these images to cope with the trauma? But how could he describe things he couldn't have known? And what did it all mean for their faith? A glimpse of the afterlife that defies logic. As Colton's recovery continued, the stories he told only grew more vivid. But what really shook his parents wasn't just the beauty he described. It was the things that seemed impossible for him to know. His descriptions of heaven were too detailed, too precise to be brushed off as a dream, and yet they didn't feel like anything Todd or Sonia had ever imagined heaven to be. "There were colors I've never seen before," Colton said one evening, sitting up in his hospital bed. "Everything was so bright, but not like the sun. It was like the light came from everything around me." He went on to describe a place filled with music. Not the kind you hear on Earth, but something deeper. "It was everywhere, and it made me feel so happy," he said. "It was like the music was alive." Colton's descriptions of heaven were innocent, but strangely profound. He talked about flowers that never wilted, animals that seemed to glow, and a peace that he said was unlike anything on Earth. "There's no sadness there," he told his parents. "Nobody cries." But it wasn't all peaceful visions. One day, Colton mentioned something that chilled his parents to the bone. "I saw people fighting," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "They were far away, but it felt like they were in trouble. Jesus said they needed help." Todd's mind raced. What could Colton mean? Was he talking about some kind of spiritual battle? Was this just a child's imagination, or something more? Colton didn't have the answers. They were questions his parents would wrestle with for years. What really haunted Todd and Sonia, though, were the messages Colton said he was given. "Jesus told me to tell you that you're doing a good job," Colton said one day, looking directly at his father. Todd froze. He had been struggling with doubts about his role as a pastor, wondering if he was truly making a difference. How could Colton know that? Was this a coincidence, or was there something bigger at play? And then there was the way Colton talked about the future. "Jesus said I have work to do," he told his parents one evening. "He said I had to come back because there were things I needed to tell people." But here's the part that left Todd and Sonia truly shaken. Colton's stories weren't just about heaven, they were also about Earth. He described things he couldn't have seen or known, details that were impossible to explain. And every time they thought they had reached the end of the mystery, Colton would casually drop another revelation that left them questioning everything they believed. A shocking message that changed everything. Now Colton's stories about heaven were detailed, vivid, and strangely convincing. But beneath the warmth and beauty of his descriptions, there was something else, something that left his parents rattled. It wasn't just about angels or bright colors. Colton claimed he'd returned with a message, one that felt bigger than his 4 years of life. And what he had to say wasn't comforting. It was the kind of thing that kept Todd and Sonia awake at night, questioning everything they thought they knew. It started innocently enough, like most of his revelations. One evening, as Todd sat beside Colton's hospital bed, his son casually mentioned, "Jesus told me to tell you something." Todd leaned in expecting another sweet anecdote. But Colton's face turned serious, and his words hit like a punch. He said, "You have to take your faith more seriously." Todd's heart stopped. As a pastor, his life revolved around faith. He spent hours each week preparing sermons, counseling others, and leading his congregation. But now his own son, a boy who barely understood the concept of faith, was calling him out. How could Colton know about the doubts Todd had been carrying, doubts he hadn't even admitted to Sonia? It felt too personal, too specific to ignore. When Colton spoke, it wasn't like he was parroting something he'd heard in church. His words carried a weight, a conviction that made even Sonia, always the practical one, wonder if her son had really experienced something extraordinary. "Jesus said you're doing a good job," Colton added, softening his earlier statement. "But you need to trust him more." For Todd, those words cut deep. He had always struggled with the idea of complete surrender, even as a pastor. And now his son, his 4-year-old son, was telling him that Jesus himself wanted him to have more faith. Todd couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a message for him. It felt bigger, like it was meant for everyone. And then came the warnings. Colton spoke of things that seemed out of place in his innocent retelling of heaven. "There's going to be a lot of fighting," he said one afternoon, his tone unusually somber. "Jesus said people need to love each other more, or things are going to get worse." Sonia felt a chill run down her spine. "What kind of fighting?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Colton shook his head. "I don't know, but it's bad." He paused, his small face clouded with a seriousness that didn't belong to a child. "Jesus is sad about it." The idea of Jesus being sad was hard for Todd and Sonia to process. Colton described him as someone full of kindness and love. Yet now he was talking about sorrow and disappointment. It made them wonder, if Colton was telling the truth, what did this mean for the world? Were they supposed to do something about it? And how could a 4-year-old understand something so heavy? But it didn't stop there. Colton started sharing things that left even the most skeptical listeners questioning their beliefs. One day he mentioned seeing big shiny gates and someone standing at them, watching carefully. "The gates were really tall," Colton said, spreading his arms wide to show the size. "And the man at the gate said not everyone gets to go through." Then without warning, Colton began to talk about time. "In heaven there's no time like here," he said. "Everything happens all at once, but it doesn't feel fast or slow. It just is." Todd and Sonia were baffled. A 4-year-old talking about the concept of time, or the lack of it? It sounded impossible. Yet Colton spoke with such clarity, such confidence, that it was hard not to believe him. "Jesus said people worry too much about time," Colton added. "He said they need to focus on what's important." "What's important?" Sonia asked, leaning closer. "Loving people," Colton said simply. "That's what matters most." It sounded so simple, yet it left Todd and Sonia reeling. How could their son speak with such wisdom? These weren't just the words of a child. They felt like truths too big for a 4-year-old to carry. As Colton continued to recover, his stories grew even more unsettling. He talked about meeting people in heaven who seemed to be waiting for something. They were happy, he said, but they were waiting for their families. "Waiting for what?" Todd asked, his voice tinged with unease. "To see them again," Colton replied. "They knew they would, but they didn't know when." It was a comforting thought on the surface, but it carried an eerie undertone. Todd couldn't shake the image of these people, standing just beyond the gates, waiting. Was this Colton's way of telling them that the afterlife wasn't as straightforward as they thought? Or was it something else entirely? Doubt and backlash turned their world upside down. At first, the Burpo family thought sharing Colton's story would bring hope and healing to others. And it did for a while. People were moved by his vivid descriptions of heaven, his encounters with angels, and his meeting with Jesus. Letters poured in from strangers across the country, thanking the family for reminding them that heaven was real. But just as quickly as the hope spread, so did the doubts. The world wasn't as warm and welcoming as their small town in Nebraska. Skepticism took root, and the questions became impossible to ignore. It started with whispers. People in the church who once prayed for Colton began to second-guess his story. Could he really have seen all that? They wondered aloud. Some dismissed it entirely. Maybe it was just a dream, others said, trying to rationalize the impossible. At first, Todd and Sonia brushed it off. After all, faith wasn't about proving anything to anyone. But as more and more people questioned them, the doubts started creeping into their own minds. What if they had misunderstood what Colton was saying? What if the story they were sharing wasn't the miracle they believed it to be? The first public backlash came when the family started speaking about Colton's story outside their community. Encouraged by friends and fellow believers, Todd began traveling to nearby towns, sharing his son's incredible journey. At first, the response was overwhelmingly positive. People showed up in droves, eager to hear about a little boy who claimed to have seen heaven. But then came the skeptics. They didn't raise their hands to ask polite questions. They cornered Todd after events, their words cutting like daggers. "Don't you think it's possible your son overheard these stories at church?" one man asked after a talk in Omaha. Another woman approached Sonia, her tone sharp. "Why are you exploiting your child like this?" For Sonia, those words were like a slap in the face. Exploiting? She didn't even want to go public with Colton's story in the first place. It was Todd who had felt the call to share it, and now people were accusing them of turning their son into some kind of marketing tool. It wasn't just strangers who doubted them. Even some of their closest friends began pulling away, unsure what to believe. "It's just a lot," one friend admitted, struggling to find the right words. "I mean, I want to believe it, but what?" Sonia wondered. Why was it so hard to believe that something miraculous could happen? The tension only grew when the family was approached about writing a book. A publisher heard about Colton's story and saw an opportunity. At first, Todd and Sonia hesitated. Writing a book felt like a huge step, one that would put their family under even more scrutiny. But after much prayer and discussion, they decided it was the right thing to do. They weren't writing for fame or fortune. They genuinely believed that Colton's story could bring hope to others. When Heaven is for Real hit the shelves, it became an instant sensation. People couldn't get enough of Colton's story, and the book flew off the shelves. The Burpos were invited to speak on national television, share their experiences with journalists, and appear at book signings. But with the fame came a darker side they hadn't anticipated. Critics emerged from every corner, dissecting their story with relentless skepticism. "This is just another example of religious propaganda," one prominent atheist tweeted. Online forums erupted with debates about the validity of Colton's experience. "Near-death experiences are just hallucinations caused by oxygen deprivation," one commenter wrote. Another claimed, "The parents are clearly coaching him to say these things. It's disgusting." The accusations were brutal. People claimed Todd and Sonia were in it for the money, that they had fabricated the entire story to sell books. Some went even further, accusing them of brainwashing their son. One particularly scathing article labeled the Burpos as religious opportunists, painting a picture of a family exploiting their child's imagination for profit. Todd tried to brush off the negativity, but it wasn't easy. As a pastor, he was used to being challenged on matters of faith. But this was different. This wasn't just about his beliefs. It was about his family, his son, and the deeply personal experience they had chosen to share. The doubts weren't just coming from strangers online. Even members of his congregation started asking questions. "Why does Colton's heaven look exactly like the one we see in paintings?" one man asked after church one Sunday. "It just seems too convenient." Convenient. That word stuck with Todd. Did people really think they were making this up for convenience? For what? Money? Fame? The idea made him sick. Yes, the book had been successful, and yes, it had brought financial relief to their family. But that wasn't why they wrote it. They did it because they believed Colton's story could change lives. But as the skepticism grew louder, Todd found himself questioning whether they had made the right decision. Had they shared too much? Was it worth putting their son in the spotlight, only for him to be doubted and ridiculed? Sonia felt the same doubts creeping in, though she tried to keep them at bay. "We know the truth," she reminded Todd during one particularly difficult night. "That's all that matters." But was it? The world seemed intent on tearing them down. One night, Todd found himself scrolling through comments online, something he knew he shouldn't do. The posts were harsh, filled with accusations and cruel jokes. But one comment stopped him cold. It simply said, "Where's the proof?" The question haunted him. Faith didn't require proof, but people did. The criticism reached a boiling point when the family appeared on a popular talk show. The host, known for her hard-hitting interviews, didn't hold back. "Colton, you've told some incredible stories about heaven," she began, her tone almost mocking. "But how do you know it wasn't just a dream?" Colton, now a little older, answered without hesitation. "Because it felt real," he said simply. "Dreams go away, but I still remember everything." The host turned to Todd. "But as a pastor, don't you think it's possible your son's experience is influenced by what he's learned in church?" Todd struggled to find the words. "I understand why people have doubts," he said finally. "But the details Colton described, things he couldn't have known, are what convinced us. He saw family members he never met. He described events in the hospital he couldn't have witnessed. These aren't things we taught him." The interview ended, but the doubts lingered. As they left the studio, Sonia turned to Todd. "Are we making things worse by talking about this?" she asked. Todd didn't have an answer. Even as the world seemed to turn against them, Colton remained unaffected. To him, the experience was simple. He had seen heaven, met Jesus, and returned with a message. The controversy swirling around him didn't seem to matter. "Jesus told me not to worry," he said one day when Todd asked how he was handling all the attention. He said people would believe what they're ready to believe. Those words brought Todd some comfort, but they didn't erase the doubts. What if they were doing more harm than good? What if sharing Colton's story was driving people further from faith instead of closer to it? And then there were the personal attacks. Strangers began showing up at their church, not to worship, but to confront Todd. "You're leading people astray," one man shouted during a service. "How can you call yourself a pastor when you're spreading lies?" Todd tried to stay calm, but inside he was shaken. He had dedicated his life to helping others find faith, and now people were accusing him of destroying it. For Sonia, the hardest part was protecting Colton. She hated the idea of her son being seen as a symbol rather than a person. He was just a little boy, trying to make sense of something extraordinary. How could they shield him from the world's harshness? As the criticism grew, so did the Burposes' resolve. They knew they couldn't convince everyone, but they believed in the power of Colton's story. "We're not here to argue," Todd said during one particularly tough speaking engagement. "We're here to share what happened. You can believe it or not. That's up to you." But the backlash left scars. Todd and Sonia found themselves questioning not just their decision to share Colton's story, but their own faith. Could they continue to trust in a world that seemed so determined to tear them down? And yet, even in doubt, there were moments of clarity. Letters from believers, messages of hope, and stories of lives changed reminded the Burpos why they had chosen this path. "It's not about us," Todd realized one day. "It's about the message." But what if the world wasn't ready to hear it? And what if the backlash was just the beginning of something even more challenging? A family divided by the mystery they couldn't escape. Sonia, always the practical one, started to wrestle with a thought she had buried since the beginning. What if we're wrong? She didn't doubt that Colton believed what he was saying. His sincerity was undeniable. But as the backlash intensified, she found herself questioning whether his memories were influenced by the trauma he had endured. After all, he had been through a life-threatening ordeal. She confided these fears to Todd one night after Colton had gone to bed. "What if it's not what we think it is?" she asked hesitantly. What if it was just his brain trying to make sense of everything?" Todd didn't answer right away. He stared at the Bible on their coffee table, his mind racing. "Do you really think a 4-year-old could make up everything he's told us?" he asked finally. "The details about Pop, the things he saw in the hospital? How could he know those things?" Sonia sighed. "I don't think he's lying, Todd. But maybe there's another explanation. Maybe it's something we'll never understand." That uncertainty hung heavy in the air between them. For Todd, Colton's story had been a reaffirmation of his faith, a reminder of everything he had ever preached. But Sonia's doubts made him uneasy. If even she, who had witnessed their son's transformation firsthand, was starting to question it, what did that mean for their family? And then there was Colton himself. As he grew older, he became more aware of the attention surrounding his story. At first, he didn't seem to mind. He would answer people's questions with the same matter-of-fact tone he had used since the beginning. But over time, the constant retelling of his experience began to wear on him. "Why do people keep asking me about it?" he asked one day, his voice tinged with frustration. "I already told them what happened." Sonia felt a pang of guilt. Had they put too much pressure on their son? She had always worried about how the spotlight would affect him, but Todd had reassured her that they were doing the right thing. Now, as she looked at Colton's weary expression, she wasn't so sure. The family's dynamic shifted in subtle but significant ways. Sonia became more protective of Colton, while Todd doubled down on his efforts to share the story. He saw it as his mission, a calling from God. But Sonia couldn't shake the feeling that they were putting their son in a position he wasn't ready for. "He's just a kid, Todd," she said during one of their many late-night arguments. "He shouldn't have to carry this burden." And what if this burden is why he came back? Todd shot back. What if this is what he's meant to do? Their arguments always ended the same way, with no resolution, just a lingering tension that neither of them wanted to confront. And through it all, Colton remained at the center, a child caught in the middle of something much bigger than himself. The turning point came during a particularly intense media appearance. The interviewer, known for his hard-hitting questions, didn't hold back. "Colton, do you ever think maybe you just dreamed all of this?" he asked, his tone borderline accusatory. Colton hesitated, glancing at his parents for reassurance. Todd gave him an encouraging nod, but Sonia's heart sank. She could see the discomfort in her son's eyes. "No," Colton said finally. "It wasn't a dream. It was real." The interviewer pressed on. "But how can you be sure? Dreams feel real too, don't they?" Colton didn't answer right away. For the first time, Sonia saw doubt flicker across his face. It was a brief moment, but it was enough to break her heart. After the interview, she pulled Todd aside. "We need to stop," she said firmly. "This isn't good for him." Todd shook his head. "We can't stop now. People need to hear this. People need to hear it, or you need them to hear it," Sonia shot back. The words hung in the air like a dagger, sharp and unforgiving. The argument that followed was one of their worst. Todd accused Sonia of losing her faith, of letting the skeptics get to her. Sonia accused Todd of putting his mission above their son's well-being. Neither of them could see the other's perspective, and for the first time, their shared faith felt like a divide instead of a bond. Colton, overhearing the argument, retreated to his room. He sat on his bed, clutching a stuffed animal he hadn't played with in years. For the first time, he began to wonder if sharing his story had been a mistake. "Jesus told me not to worry," he whispered to himself. "But what if they're right? What if it wasn't real?" Colton's sense of isolation only grew in the weeks that followed. Wherever he went, people seemed to expect something from him: answers, reassurance, or even proof. At church, members of the congregation would approach him after services, their questions loaded with desperation. "Did you see my grandma?" one elderly woman asked, her eyes brimming with tears. "She passed away last year." "Did you see her there?" Colton didn't know how to respond. He hadn't seen everyone in heaven. How could he explain that to someone who so desperately wanted hope? "I'm not sure," he replied quietly, but the disappointment in the woman's face lingered with him long after she walked away. For a child who had always been curious and full of life, the constant pressure to live up to the expectations of others was suffocating. At school, his classmates whispered about him behind his back. Some called him the heaven boy, while others mocked him outright. "What's it like to float on a cloud?" one boy sneered during lunch, drawing laughter from the table. Colton tried to brush it off, but the teasing stung. He began withdrawing from his peers, spending more time alone. Even at home, he seemed quieter, more reserved. Sonia noticed the change immediately. "He's carrying too much," she told Todd one night. "We need to take a step back for his sake." Todd, however, couldn't see it. To him, Colton's story was too important to keep quiet. "People need to hear this, Sonia," he insisted. "It's not just about Colton, it's about what his story means for everyone." But Sonia wasn't convinced. "And what about what it means for him?" she shot back. "He's a little boy, Todd. He didn't ask for this." The tension between them grew worse as Todd continued to accept speaking engagements, often bringing Colton along. Sonia tried to shield her son, but there were limits to what she could do. "You don't have to go if you don't want to," she told him before one event. But Colton, always eager to please his parents, agreed to go anyway. The events themselves were exhausting for him. Standing in front of hundreds of strangers, answering the same questions over and over, drained his energy and his spirit. What did heaven look like, someone would ask, and Colton would give the same answers he had given 100 times before. "It was bright. There were colors I've never seen before. There were angels." The answers never seemed to satisfy people. They always wanted more. Details, validation, something to prove that what Colton experienced was real. And when he couldn't give them what they wanted, the doubts grew louder. At one event, a man in the audience stood up and asked bluntly, "How much are your parents paying you to say this stuff?" The question sent a ripple of unease through the room. Colton froze, unsure how to respond. Todd stepped in, his voice firm. My son isn't paid to share his story. He's telling the truth, whether you believe it or not. But the damage was done. Colton felt the weight of the accusation long after the event ended. Why do they think I'm lying? He asked Sonia later that night. I'm just telling them what happened. Sonia didn't have an answer. All she could do was hold her son and try to reassure him. People doubt what they don't understand, she said. But even as she spoke the words, she wasn't sure she believed them herself. The divide in the family deepened as the backlash continued. Todd became increasingly defensive, determined to protect both his son and the story he believed in so deeply. But Sonia's concerns about Colton's well-being grew stronger. This isn't about faith anymore, she told Todd during yet another argument. It's about our son. Can't you see what this is doing to him? Todd refused to back down. I'm doing this for him, for us, for everyone who needs to know heaven is real, he argued. But his words rang hollow to Sonia, who saw the toll it was taking on their family. Colton, caught in the middle, began to feel the strain of his parents' conflict. He hated seeing them fight, especially over something that felt so personal to him. One night as he lay awake in bed, he prayed silently. Jesus, why did you send me back? He whispered. It's so hard. I don't know what to do. Colton's prayer hung heavy in the quiet of his room. He wanted to believe that his experience had a purpose, that everything he had seen and felt was meant for something good. But as the days passed, he couldn't shake the feeling that his story was causing more harm than help, not just to him, but to his family. The tension at home became almost unbearable. Todd buried himself in his work at the church and in the speaking engagements that kept pouring in. Sonia, on the other hand, started pulling back from public appearances, insisting that Colton needed space to just be a kid. Their differing approaches only deepened the divide between them. Every conversation seemed to end in an argument, with neither willing to give an inch. One evening, after another long day of interviews and meetings, Todd came home to find Sonia sitting alone at the kitchen table. The house was unusually quiet. Where's Colton? He asked, setting down his bag. He's in his room, Sonia replied, not looking up. He didn't want to talk to anyone tonight. Todd frowned. What happened? Sonia finally met his gaze, her eyes filled with frustration and sadness. What do you think happened, Todd? He's exhausted. He's confused. And he's starting to feel like all of this is his fault. Todd sat down across from her, rubbing his temples. I don't know what you want me to do, Sonia, he said quietly. We can't just stop. People need to hear his story. But what about what he needs? Sonia shot back. Have you even asked him how he feels about all of this? Or are you too busy trying to convince the world that heaven is real? Todd flinched at her words. He knew she was right in some ways, but he couldn't shake the feeling that stepping back would be a betrayal, not just to Colton, but to the message they had been entrusted with. I'm doing this for him, he insisted. I'm doing this because I believe it's what God wants us to do. Sonia shook her head, tears streaming down her face. Then maybe you should start asking God what's best for Colton, instead of what's best for your mission. Their argument left a silence in the house that felt heavier than any they had experienced before. Todd couldn't sleep that night. He found himself pacing the living room, replaying Sonia's words over and over in his mind. Was he pushing too hard? Was he so focused on the story that he had lost sight of his own son? The next morning, Todd decided to talk to Colton directly. He knocked gently on his son's bedroom door and found him sitting on the floor, surrounded by his favorite toys. Hey, buddy, Todd said, sitting down beside him. Can we talk? Colton nodded but didn't look up. Todd hesitated, searching for the right words. How are you feeling about everything? About the interviews, the talks, the book? All of it? Colton shrugged. I don't know. Todd's heart sank. He had hoped for more, but he could see that his son was struggling to put his feelings into words. Do you ever wish we could stop talking about it? He asked gently. Colton looked up then, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and confusion. Sometimes, he admitted, but I don't want people to think I'm lying. Todd felt a lump form in his throat. "No one who really knows you thinks that," he said firmly. "You're the bravest kid I've ever met, Colton, and whatever happens, I'm proud of you." Colton gave a small smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Do we have to keep doing all the interviews?" he asked after a long pause. Todd hesitated. He knew the interviews were important. They helped spread the message. But looking at his son, he realized that no message was worth the cost of Colton's happiness and well-being. "We can take a break," he said finally. "You don't have to do anything you don't want to do." Colton's relief was visible, and for the first time in weeks, he seemed a little lighter. But even as Todd made that promise, he knew stepping back wouldn't solve everything. The questions, the doubts, and the scrutiny weren't going to disappear. And deep down, he still wrestled with his own uncertainties. Why had Colton been chosen to have this experience? Why was their family tasked with sharing such an incredible story? And why did it feel like the burden was growing heavier with each passing day? Sonia, meanwhile, was doing her best to shield Colton from the outside world. She started limiting his exposure to media and public events, creating a safe space for him at home. But even within the safety of their home, Colton couldn't escape the questions that haunted him. One night, as Sonia was tucking him into bed, Colton asked her, "Mom, why do some people think I made it up?" Sonia's chest tightened. She had been dreading this question, knowing it would come eventually. "Because sometimes it's hard for people to believe things they can't see," she said carefully. "It doesn't mean they think you're a bad person. It just means they don't understand." Colton seemed to think about that for a moment. "But I saw it," he said, his voice small but firm. "I really saw it." "I know you did," Sonia replied, brushing his hair back gently. "And your dad knows it too. That's all that matters." But was it? For Colton, the weight of being believed, or not, felt like a responsibility far greater than he could handle. And for Sonia, the doubts continued to creep in, threatening to shake the foundation of her own faith. The weight of doubt didn't just linger, it grew heavier, becoming a near constant presence in the Burpo household. Colton, caught in the center of it all, began retreating further into himself. The once energetic boy who lit up every room now preferred the quiet corners of their home, away from the eyes of the world. Sonia noticed this shift most acutely. One afternoon, she found him sitting by the window, staring out at the backyard. His toys were untouched, and his usually inquisitive demeanor was absent. "What's on your mind, sweetie?" she asked, kneeling beside him. Colton hesitated, then turned to her with wide, searching eyes. "Mom, what if I forgot something important?" he asked softly. Sonia's heart sank. "Forgot what, honey?" "Something Jesus told me," Colton said, his voice trembling. "What if I'm supposed to tell people and I don't remember? What if I mess up?" It was a crushing realization for Sonia. Her son wasn't just struggling with the burden of being doubted. He was carrying the impossible weight of feeling responsible for delivering a divine message. "Oh, Colton," she said, pulling him into a hug. "You're doing the best you can. That's all anyone could ask of you." But her words did little to comfort him. That night, as she lay in bed next to Todd, she couldn't hold back her tears. "He's just a kid, Todd," she said, her voice breaking. "And he's terrified that he's going to fail." Todd, who had been quietly reading his Bible, closed it and turned to her. "What do you want me to do, Sonia? I've already cut back on the interviews. I've done everything you've asked." "It's not enough," Sonia said firmly. "We need to stop everything. No more talks, no more interviews, no more book tours. He needs to be a child again." Todd's jaw tightened. "And what about the people who need to hear his story? What about the lives it could save?" Sonia sat up, glaring at him. "What about our son? What about saving his life? You think this is what God wants? For him to be scared all the time? To feel like he's letting the whole world down?" The argument escalated, each of them digging their heels in deeper. By the time they finally fell silent, the tension between them felt insurmountable. And as Todd turned out the light, he couldn't help but wonder if their family was unraveling. The cracks became more visible as time went on. Colton's once effortless recollections of heaven started to feel rehearsed. He began pausing before answering questions, as if he were second-guessing himself. This didn't go unnoticed by those around him. At one event, a man approached Todd afterward and said, "Your son's story is amazing, but it seems like he's struggling to remember the details. Are you sure he's not just trying to please people?" The comment hit Todd like a punch to the gut. He had always believed in Colton's story, but now even he was starting to see the strain it was putting on his son. That night, he prayed harder than he had in years, asking God for clarity. "If this is your will," he whispered, "then show me how to help my son carry it." But the answers didn't come easily. The family was trapped in a cycle of doubt and pressure with no clear way out. Then something unexpected happened. Colton began asking questions of his own, questions that shook Todd and Sonia to their core. "Why did Jesus send me back?" he asked one evening, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why didn't he just let me stay in heaven?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications neither parent was ready to confront. Todd tried to reassure him. "Because he knew we needed you here, buddy." But Colton wasn't satisfied. "What if I'm not doing it right?" he asked, tears welling in his eyes. "What if I wasn't supposed to come back?" For Todd and Sonia, these moments were almost unbearable. How could they reassure their son when they didn't have the answers themselves? And how could they continue to share his story when it was clearly causing him so much pain? One particularly eerie moment came late at night, when Sonia found Colton sitting on the stairs, wide awake. "What are you doing up, honey?" she asked, kneeling beside him. "I couldn't sleep," Colton replied, his voice small. "I keep thinking about the people I saw in heaven." Sonia frowned. "What about them?" Colton hesitated, then looked at her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "Some of them were waiting for their families," he said. "But some of them looked scared." The words sent a chill down Sonia's spine. "Scared of what?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," Colton said, shaking his head. "But they didn't look happy. It's like they were waiting for something bad." Sonia didn't know how to respond. Colton's earlier descriptions of heaven had always been filled with light and joy. This new detail felt like a shadow creeping into the story, something darker and more unsettling. "Maybe you were just dreaming, sweetie," she said finally, though she didn't believe it herself. Colton shook his head. "It wasn't a dream, Mom. It felt real." The encounter left Sonia rattled. She didn't tell Todd about it right away, unsure of how he would react. But the image of those scared people lingered in her mind, haunting her thoughts. The final revelation that changed everything. As time passed, the Burpo family started to feel as if their lives were caught in a web of unanswered questions and eerie moments they couldn't escape. Colton's memories, once a source of hope and comfort, had turned into a riddle that no one seemed capable of solving. It wasn't just the details of heaven that left them puzzled. It was what he remembered beyond the gates, in the shadows of that otherworldly place. Colton had always described heaven as a realm of peace and light, but his more recent recollections hinted at something deeper, darker, and far more complex. It wasn't just about the bright colors, the music, or even the angels. It was about what he wasn't supposed to see. What he had glimpsed outside of the light, on the edges of heaven's perfection, left a lingering unease that no one in the family could ignore. The turning point came on a quiet evening in the middle of summer. The family had tried to reclaim some sense of normalcy by focusing on everyday activities. Colton was in the backyard, sitting under the old oak tree where he often went to draw or read. Sonia, watching from the kitchen window, noticed that he seemed unusually still, almost as if he were frozen in thought. She stepped outside to check on him, calling his name softly. But Colton didn't respond. When she approached, she saw that his eyes were locked on something in the distance, something she couldn't see. "Colton, are you okay?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. Slowly, he turned to her, his expression blank yet strangely intense. "They're here," he said quietly, his voice carrying an edge of fear. Sonia's heart raced. "Who's here?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted the answer. Colton didn't elaborate. He simply stood up, brushed off his pants, and walked inside as if nothing had happened. But Sonia couldn't shake the chill that ran through her. Who or what had he seen? She decided not to tell Todd about the encounter. She didn't want to add to the already heavy burden they were carrying. Over the next few weeks, Colton began to withdraw even more. He spent hours alone in his room, his drawings becoming darker and more abstract. Instead of gates and angels, he began sketching strange, shadowy figures in swirling vortexes that seemed to lead nowhere. When Todd stumbled upon one of these drawings, he couldn't hide his alarm. The image depicted what looked like a figure standing at the edge of a vast, empty void. The figure's face was blank, and its hands were outstretched, as if it were trying to stop something or someone from passing through. Todd brought the drawing to Sonia, his hands trembling. "What is this?" he asked, holding it up. Sonia looked at the paper, her stomach twisting in knots. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I think we need to talk to him about it." When they confronted Colton, he was reluctant to explain. "It's just something I saw," he said vaguely. But Todd wasn't satisfied. "Something you saw where?" he pressed. Colton hesitated before finally answering. "Before I came back." The words hit Todd and Sonia like a thunderclap. They had assumed that Colton's memories of heaven ended when he returned to his body, but now it seemed there was more. Something he hadn't shared, or perhaps something he hadn't been ready to remember until now. "What else do you remember?" Todd asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Colton didn't look at them as he spoke. "There were places I wasn't supposed to go, but I saw them anyway." The room fell silent as his words hung in the air. Todd and Sonia exchanged a glance, both of them grappling with the enormity of what Colton had just revealed. What did he mean by places he wasn't supposed to go? And why had he seen them? Over the next few days, Colton began to share more details, though his recollections were fragmented and often disjointed. He spoke of corridors of darkness that seemed to stretch on forever, filled with a deafening silence that made his chest tighten just thinking about it. He described figures that lingered in the shadows, watching but never speaking. And then there was the void, the vast, empty space that seemed to pull everything toward it, like a black hole swallowing light. Todd struggled to make sense of these descriptions. They didn't align with anything he had ever read in scripture or heard in his years as a pastor. Sonia, on the other hand, found herself growing more and more uneasy. She couldn't help but wonder if these memories were connected to the watchers in the in-between Colton had mentioned before. Were these shadowy figures the same as the ones he had seen at the edges of heaven? And if so, what did they want? Colton's demeanor changed as well. He became quieter, more cautious, as if he were carrying a secret too heavy to bear. He started avoiding certain rooms in the house, claiming they felt too cold or too dark. When Todd asked him what he meant, Colton simply said, "They're waiting." "Waiting for what?" Todd asked, but Colton didn't answer. As the weeks turned into months, the Burpos couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease that seemed to permeate their home. Strange things began happening, lights flickering for no apparent reason, doors creaking open on their own, and a chilling draft that seemed to come and go without explanation. At first, they chalked it up to their imaginations or the quirks of an old house. But as the incidents became more frequent, they began to wonder if something else was at play. Sonia, in particular, couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She often caught herself glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see one of the shadowy figures from Colton's drawing standing in the corner of the room. She tried to dismiss these thoughts as paranoia, but they persisted, gnawing at the edges of her mind. Todd, ever the skeptic, refused to entertain the idea that anything supernatural was happening. "We're just stressed," he insisted. "That's all this is." But Sonia wasn't convinced. Neither was Colton. One night, as Sonia was tucking him into bed, he grabbed her hand and whispered, "They're closer now." "Who?" Sonia asked, her voice trembling. "The Watchers," Colton replied. "They're waiting for me to remember." The words sent a shiver down Sonia's spine. What was Colton supposed to remember? And why did it feel like time was running out? The final piece of the puzzle came on a stormy night when the family was huddled together in the living room, waiting out the heavy rain. Colton had been unusually quiet all day, and Sonia could tell something was weighing on him. She decided to gently prod him, hoping he would open up. "Is there something you want to tell us?" she asked, her tone soft but firm. Colton hesitated before nodding. I saw someone, he said finally. Someone who told me why I had to come back. Todd leaned forward, his heart pounding. Who did you see? Colton's gaze was distant, as if he were looking at something far away. It wasn't Jesus, he said. It was something else. The room fell deathly silent. Todd and Sonia waited, barely breathing, as Colton struggled to find the words to explain. They said I had to come back because there were things I needed to warn people about, he continued. Things that were coming. What things? Sonia asked, her voice barely audible. Colton shook his head. I don't know, but they said people wouldn't listen unless I came back. The revelation left Todd and Sonia reeling. It wasn't the comforting message of hope and salvation they had believed in. It was something far more ominous, a warning of things to come, shrouded in mystery and fear. Colton's revelation left the room heavy with silence. For Todd and Sonia, it was as though a storm had passed through their lives, leaving them uncertain about what remained. But as they sat with their son, trying to process everything he had said, a small but steady clarity began to emerge. Colton's memories, no matter how unsettling, were not meant to frighten them. They were meant to guide them. That night, Todd found himself sitting alone in the family's small prayer room. The house was quiet, the storm outside finally fading into a soft drizzle. He opened his Bible to a verse he had turned to many times before, but now felt more relevant than ever. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. The words resonated in his heart, reminding him of the foundation of his faith, that even in the face of the unknown, God's plan is always good. The next morning, Todd gathered his family in the living room. We don't need to have all the answers, he said, looking at Sonia and Colton with a newfound sense of peace. What matters is that we trust God's purpose in all of this. Colton, your experience is a gift, even if it's hard to understand right now. Colton nodded, his young face filled with a quiet determination. Jesus told me not to worry, he said, and I won't. From that moment forward, the Burpo family decided to let go of the fear and focus on their faith. They couldn't explain every detail of Colton's journey, but they could trust that it was part of a bigger plan. They leaned on prayer, scripture, and each other, finding strength in the message that had brought them together from the start, that heaven is real, love conquers all, and Jesus is always with them. What do you think? Was Colton's journey a divine message or something beyond our understanding? Let us know in the comments. If you found this story as fascinating as we did, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more.